Shout to the Lord, all the earth, let us sing. Power and majesty, praise to the King. Mountains bow down and the seas will roar at the sound of your name. I sing for joy at the work of your hands. Forever I'll love you, forever I'll stand. Nothing compares to the promise I have in. Nothing compares to the promise I have in you. You may be seated.
Thank you. Good to see everyone. Glad you're here this morning. We're so thankful for your presence. We're going to wrap up this series on the family, basically. And I want to remind you, this coming Friday at 6:30 is pre-registration. We will have our Stronger Families Workshop this Friday evening. Actually going to begin at 7, but if you haven't registered, pre-registration at 6:30. We'll be done by 9 o'clock Friday night, and then about 9 o'clock till noon on Saturday. It's not going to take your whole weekend, and this is something that I promise you will benefit from. Let me tell you a few things in view of that. Corey, I brag on him a lot. He is the chief of advertising and getting the word out there. And he and I were on the Dave Ellswick show Friday afternoon. Never done that before. That was kind of neat, and we had a great time with that. And he was really nice and gave us a 30-minute slot and talked to us about this workshop for 30 minutes. So that was really good. To top that off, this Thursday at noon, Corey and I will be on Today's THV. And they'll give us about a 2 or 3 minute segment interviewing us again about the upcoming workshop. So really, a lot of doors have opened. I mean, we can thank Liz Massey, who is a community member, works for Cabot Schools now. She opened that door for us, really, and we appreciate that. But a lot of neat things are happening. We're getting the word out there, but we need you to be here Friday night and Saturday morning as well. About 2 weeks ago, you remember the old camcorders you'd hold up like this and video your kids? About 2 weeks ago, we ran across one we had packed away, apparently. And we were able to plug it into the TV and watch these videos. Well, it immediately, they're, of course, videos of the kids, immediately takes me back to 2003. It was like yesterday. And I'm watching the 7-year-old and the 5-year-old and the 1-year-old that's barely talking, and her hair just looks like a Q-tip, real frizzy. And I remember everything that happened there like it was yesterday. And then my mind is flooded with questions like, what kind of dad have you been? Have you done okay? What about your parenting? How are you? Started thinking about that. You know, all of us have different philosophies and ideas. I need some help, so it's fine. Really. I mean, everybody would pay closer attention if she was up here with me, I promise. We have different philosophies. We have different ideas when it comes to parenting. Even the doctors and the authors, best-selling book guys, one will say, this is the way you need to handle this scenario, or you need to spank them every time. And others would say, no, don't spank them. They're too fragile. You can't do that. So there's constant differing ideas and philosophies when it comes to parenting. And I think we're in that same boat. We're struggling. Do I do this? Do I do that? Well, I think it's best here. Or I think it's best to try this. But what about God's plan for parents? What about God's plan? I think there are a few things we need to know. In Psalm 127, in verse 3, I want you to see, first of all, that every child belongs to his or her Creator. I want to stress that. Our children belong to the Creator. And some of the things I say this morning, it may catch you a little off guard. This may not be your typical parenting lesson. Every child belongs to his or her Creator. In Psalm 127 in verse 3, it says, sons are a heritage from the Lord, and children a reward from Him. God gives the children. He entrusts the children to our care. They belong to Him. Jeremiah 1, verses 4 and 5. The word of the Lord came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. So don't you think that if God knew Jeremiah before He made and created and formed Jeremiah in his mother's womb, don't you think He knew you and your children that way? You see, He knew our kids before we did. Even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Matthew 10 and verse 30. That says, I know you. I know you better than you know you. And oh, by the way, I know your children better than you know them. In fact, I've known your children longer than you've known them. I knew them before I formed them. Every child belongs to the Creator. Step one in good parenting is this: realizing our kids don't belong to us. I don't know if I like that too much. I don't know if I do either, but I think that's the truth. I think that's the reality of it. Every child in every home all over the globe belongs to the Creator God. And we parents claim ownership, and we parade our kids around like they're trophies, our trophies. Ownership parenting is about what the parent wants for the kids. Ownership parenting is about what I can get from my kids. Ownership parenting is motivated by what we want our kids to be, and the kids belong to God, so it's not about our will. Here's the key: it's about His will. How many parents spend so many hours, so much time, so many days just trying to pump their will into their kid? I know I have. I'm thinking, I want this kid to be this. This kid's going to be great at this. This is what I've groomed her for. This kid, man, I hope she can play ball in college. I don't know. But that's my will. That's what I want for her and for him and for the other her. That's what I want. Every child, and this is a reality check for me. Your children, I've entrusted them to you for a little while. I don't know how long that is. Every child belongs to his or her Creator. And God said, I knew you before I formed you. That's pretty powerful. He knew our kids before we had even an idea. Boy or girl. Dylan or Faith. All right, that takes us to our second point. Parents are God's ambassadors in child rearing. We're God's ambassadors. Now, here's the interesting thing about an ambassador. An ambassador speaks not for himself or herself. An ambassador speaks for the one they work for. And we're working for Him. God has entrusted these kids to us for a little while. My prayer is that I have my kids for the rest of my life. My plan is for them to bury me. Right? That's your plan. But as parents, We work for God to do His will, to accomplish His plan in the lives of our kids. We are God's ambassadors. We are God's agents. We are God's tools to shape the souls of our children. When you think about it like that, it's a little overwhelming. When you think about it like that, it's a little intimidating. I'm thinking, man, it's a lot easier to throw a ball around. It's a lot easier for the Tea Party thing, and those things are important. Don't misunderstand me. But when we start thinking on this big, broad scale that we are God's tools, God's working through us, God's using us to shape the souls of our children, it gets serious real fast. That puts emphasis on some things that I'm not sure if we've really grasped before. I'm going to tell you two things under this point that I want you, and I don't ever tell you to write them down, but I'd write these down. I think these are important. It's God's will that parents make children aware of His existence. That's God's will. That's God's will, that you make your children aware that there's a God in heaven, that God exists. That's on you, parents. That's on me. That's my responsibility. Make sure they can throw a ball? Absolutely. Make sure they do well in school? Yes. Study with them? You better believe it. But my greatest responsibility, your greatest responsibility as a parent, is make sure they know there's a God in heaven. Greatest responsibility as a parent. You remember that one. Then, here's the next one. Parents, make sure they know there's a God in heaven. Then lead your children to have a God-submissive life. Show your children, lead them to where they live a life in submission to God. It's my responsibility to make sure they know there's a God in heaven, but it's also my responsibility to make sure they live a life in submission to Him. Above everything else, that's what matters most. At the end of the day, that's all that matters. At the end of the life, that's all that matters. I have never done a funeral where we're talking about the daddy or the mama, either one. And they bragged and bragged and bragged about his son because his son could throw a ball better than the other kids because his dad invested all that time. Dads do that. But that's not the most important thing. It's not the most important thing. In the big picture, it's really seemingly insignificant, in fact. So we want to make sure, it's our responsibility to make sure our children are conscious of God and to make sure that our children lead lives in submission to God. So Deuteronomy 6, go there with me. Setting it up to go here. Deuteronomy 6. We should talk and teach our kids about God every chance we can. Every opportunity. Listen, Deuteronomy 6, 4 and following. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Memorize these things. Learn these things. To put them on your hearts is to memorize these laws that I'm giving you today. And then in verse 7, he gets very serious. Impress them on your children. These commands, impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. But talk about them with your kids. Every opportunity with our children that we can have a God-centered God talk. Folks, we need to do it. Because when they leave our home, and even while they're in our home to some extent, they're inundated with talk that's not God talk. He's saying, tell your kids about these commands, how important they are, and how they center us on the Creator. Look at Ephesians 6. Ephesians 6. In verse 4, he says, Fathers, do not exasperate, enrage, embitter, infuriate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Raise your kids. Training, instruction of the Lord. Raise your kids in the training and instruction of the dance studio. Raise your kids in the training and instruction of the ball field and the ball court and the cheer clinic. You say, man, you're getting personal. You need to listen. You need to listen. Those things are fantastic, and we've been involved in many of them. And they're awesome. They're great because they build responsibility and character in those kids, and they need those things. But what they don't need is parents pumping that down their throat as if that is the end-all of life. As if every kid's going to make it to the major leagues. Every kid's going to be in the NBA. Every kid's going to be on Broadway or a Hollywood actor or actress. Not that you want that anyway, but we won't go down that road. The point is this, those things are fantastic, but it's my responsibility to talk with my kids about God. Now I may use all of those outlets from the baseball field to the dance studio or whatever else to have those conversations and to put things in perspective. These are extracurricular fun activities that we do, that we grow from, that we learn from, that we get in shape and all of those types of things. But God is the most important. We are His ambassadors to make sure our kids know He's there. We are His ambassadors to make sure our kids live lives in submission to Him. This training in the instruction of the Lord is a hands-on type of training. You know what that means? If I'm going to train my kids in the instruction of the Lord, if I'm going to train my kids to live submissive lives before God, I got to do it. Hands-on type of training says, watch and let me show you. I don't just throw a Bible at them and say, read it, memorize it, learn it, live it. I want them to read it. I think it's great if they memorize it. I definitely want them to live it, but they're going to do what I do. So I got to model that. I've got to live that. As God's ambassadors, we're entrusted to raise our kids in the Lord. We must show them. And there's a phrase that drives me insane, and I'm going to share it with you. Do as I say. What's the rest of it? Not as I do. Hypocrisy is what it is. Absolute hypocrisy. Heard it when I was a kid. You do as I say, not as I do. Let me translate that for you. I can talk the way I want because I'm an adult, but you can't. I can act the way I want because I'm an adult, but you can't. Complete mass confusion. And we're saying to them, when you get to be an adult, you can talk how you want. You can live how you want. You can do what you want. Do as I say, not as I do. Absolute hypocrisy. I've got to live the life. I've got to model the life. As an ambassador of God raising these kids, I've got to model the life that I want them to live. I've got to make sure they understand the existence of God. I've got to make sure they understand the importance of a life in submission to God. And I got to show them that. All right, let's move on. Thirdly, Thirdly, as parents, we are parenting sinners. Can you believe he just said that? We are. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, Romans 3:23. We're parenting sinners. You say, well, now, come on. Babies aren't born sinners. Now, I know that, but they're born with a sinful nature. And what that means is that one day, they're going to be full-fledged sinners, and they're going to have the comprehension, the understanding of what sin is. And then what are we going to do? We're going to begin to teach them about the gospel. We're going to begin to teach them about baptism in hopes that they'll come and daddy or granddaddy or whoever can baptize them into Christ. If they weren't sinners, why would we want to see them baptized into Christ? I'm not saying, please get me here. I'm not saying babies are sinners and we need to baptize them. You know me better than that. But we're all born with a sinful nature. We're all going to, at some point, come to the understanding of what sin is. If that, we call it the age of accountability. You know what that age is? It depends on the child, doesn't it? 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. But at that point, and they realize, they start feeling guilty, and they realize what sin is when they do wrong, or when they tell a little lie, or when they don't do what they're supposed to, and they feel guilty, they understand what sin is, then that's a sinner. And we teach them and we baptize them. That's what we want, right? But I say this, you don't have a problem, in saying, well, yeah, I'm a sinner, but when we start looking at our kids as sinners, that's a whole different scenario. That's borderline offensive. You talking about my faith? You talking about my Ashlyn? My Dylan? Really? My point is this: we have to understand that we are parenting imperfect sinners. So let's get this equation together. We imperfect parents, we imperfect sinful parents are parenting imperfect sinful children. You know what that equals? I don't either, but it can't be good, right? It's tough. It's hard. Kids will bring, and let me just call it like it is, kids will bring shame on you. Kids will bring humiliation on you because they're sinful and they mess up. And we're flabbergasted when they do that. We're blown away, offended, can't believe it. You're my child. And I'm not making excuses. And this is not to condone that type of behavior. I'm going somewhere with this. But this is to say they're not any different than you. You just have more experience at the Christian thing and at the life thing. They're sinners too. Maybe that explains a little bit of why this is so difficult, this kid thing and parent thing and raising them right. And, I can't believe they did that. Let's sweep that under the rug because we don't want anyone to know that our kid would what? Would sin? Are you kidding me? But I say that to say this. God has extended His grace, forgiveness, mercy, patience to us so that we can extend that grace to our children. Ephesians 4:32, it's not up there. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as in Christ God forgave you. So just the way God forgave you in Christ. He said, I want you to forgive everybody else. And your kids too. Because they sin and they will sin and they make mistakes. Not a license to condone sin. But parents must be patient, loving, and full of grace. Let me say this. I'm not saying we need to embrace it, but we certainly must accept their sinfulness. Because if we don't, we're putting them on a pedestal to fail and us to be heartbroken. They're just not perfect. Even your little sweet babies aren't perfect. We must accept our kids' sinfulness and help them to navigate through this life with their eyes on God. Every child belongs to his or her Creator. Parents are God's ambassadors in child rearing. And parents were parenting sinners. And finally, last of all, and maybe this is where the rubber meets the road. I think it's all important, but this is the way to walk out this morning. This is the way to leave. This is what you need to be thinking about this afternoon, tonight, and this week. Parents are to return faithful children to God. When you think about what is the job of a parent, and we think about, well, I got to feed them, I got to clothe them, I got to play with them, I got to teach them, I got to educate them, I got to change diapers, I got to all this stuff. Let me wrap it all up and put a pretty little bow on it. Our job is to return our children to God faithful. He entrusted us with them for a little while, however long that is. And I got to give them back. You got to give them back faithful to God. You remember the story in 1 Samuel 1 where Hannah is barren and she wants a child. She wants a son so bad. In 1 Samuel 1, 9 through 28, and she prays to God. And he even makes this vow. Listen to the vow in verse 11. She made a vow saying, "Oh Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me and not forget your servant, but give her a son." Here's the vow. "Then I'll give him to the Lord for all the days of his life." If you'll just give me a son, I'm going to give him right back to you. I'm going to give him to you, Lord. Verses 24 and following, she kept her vow. After he was weaned, she took the boy, Samuel's who we're talking about, with her, young as he was, along with the 3-year-old bull and an ephah of flour and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh, to the temple. When they had slaughtered the bull, they brought the boy to Eli, and he said, and she said to him, "As surely as you live, my Lord, I'm the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I pray for this child. The Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." And he worshiped the Lord there. Now we don't go drop our kids at the temple. And please don't think you get aggravated with your kids. You could just run them and drop them at the church building this week. Say, "Hey, we're dedicating them to the Lord." No, we're not doing it that way, okay? But we give them to God spiritually. We give them back to God as faithful Christian servants. We raise them to be Christian servants so we can return faithful children to God. And this puts a lot of pressure on parents because this requires parents to be faithful ourselves to God. Faithful to His Word, faithful to the church. I mean, I've always said, you want your kids to be faithful, you be faithful. And you say, well, it doesn't always work that way. I know that. But I know if it's going to work, it's going to have to be that way. Most of the time. Most of the time. This requires parents to invest more time and effort into the spiritual life of your child. What are we putting into them spiritually? Greatest responsibility of all parents is to return faithful children to God. Let me say this and I'll stop. Your kids are going to leave your home one day. Your kids are going to leave. That's what we do. We're God's ambassadors. We're trying to prepare them to leave the home. They're going to leave the home one day. And we want them to leave the home knowing that true success is about being a faithful Christian my whole life. That's what we wanted to know. Parenting is the hardest job on the planet. But I think it's a little easier when we do it God's way. Every child belongs to his or her Creator. Parents are God's ambassadors in child rearing. It's about doing God's will. It's about making sure they know God exists and making sure they understand they've got to live submissive lives before God. We're parenting sinners, and we're to return faithful children to God. Today, if we could help you, if we could serve